The Enigma Revealed. Bletchley Park, March 1941, March 24, 1941, 2:37 p.m. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. The air inside cottage number 3 hung heavy with pipe tobacco and aging paper. Mavis Lever, a 19-year-old woman with dark hair pinned behind her ears, leaned over her work desk, covered with scribbled sheets. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her round glasses, not from exhaustion, but from something more visceral, pure excitement. Before her lay a partially decrypted Italian naval signal. The Regia Marina's encrypted communications had been flowing through Bletchley Park's interception stations for weeks, but this one was different. This one felt urgent. Dilly Knox stood behind her, his gaunt frame casting a shadow across the workspace. At 57, the veteran cryptanalyst looked older than his years, his face lined with the exhaustion of countless sleepless nights, wrestling with Enigma variants. But his eyes, those sharp, penetrating eyes, remained alert as a hawk's. "Read it again," Knox instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. Mavis cleared her throat. The partially broken message referenced Day -3, a designation that made her pulse quicken. Italian naval operations planning used this terminology for coordinated fleet movements. She had seen it before in training exercises, but never with this level of encrypted urgency. Outside, the March wind howled through the Victorian mansion's grounds, rattling the cottage's windows. Inside, time seemed suspended. The clacking of typewriters from adjacent rooms faded into background noise as Mavis's pencil scratched across the cryptanalysis worksheet. The Italian naval Enigma machine, a modified commercial version, had been Knox's obsession for months. Unlike the German naval Enigma with its additional complexity, the Italian variant used predictable operator procedures. Predictability was the cryptanalyst's greatest ally. Knox leaned closer, his pipe smoke curling around Mavis's shoulder. "The indicators," he muttered, pointing to a sequence on her sheet. "They're using the same rotor settings as last week's exercise transmissions." Mavis's heart raced. Italian operators under pressure to transmit quickly, often recycled encryption settings, a fatal security flaw. Her fingers flew across the worksheets, applying the previous week's recovered key settings to this new message. Letters transformed into words, words crystallized into meaning. Supermarina authorizes departure. 26th March, operation against convoy routes, south of Crete. Knox straightened abruptly, nearly dropping his pipe. "Get Commander Travis, now!" The implications crashed through both their minds like a physical force. Admiral Angelo Iachino's battle fleet, the pride of Mussolini's navy, was preparing to sortie into the eastern Mediterranean. The target: British convoys supplying Greece through Alexandria. Mavis continued working, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. More fragments emerged from the encrypted chaos. Luftwaffe air cover confirmed. Rendezvous point east of Sicily. Anticipate no enemy capital ships. That last phrase made Knox smile grimly. The Italians believed they would achieve complete surprise. They believed Admiral Andrew Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet lay unsuspecting in Alexandria harbor. They believed wrong. Within the hour, the fully decrypted message sat on the desk of Commander Edward Travis, Bletchley Park's operational director. By 4:00 p.m., an encrypted ultra-signal was transmitted via secure channels to the Admiralty in London. By 6:00 p.m., a coded message marked Most Secret arrived at Admiral Cunningham's headquarters in Alexandria, Egypt. The Italian fleet would sail in 48 hours, but this time they wouldn't be hunting blind prey. This time, the hunter would become the hunted. Mavis Lever returned to her worksheets, already working on the next intercept. She couldn't know that her breakthrough would help orchestrate one of the Royal Navy's most devastating ambushes of the entire war. She couldn't know that 303 Italian sailors would never see home again because of the letters she decrypted that cold March afternoon. Outside cottage number 3, the sun dipped toward the English countryside horizon. In the Mediterranean, 1,800 miles south, warships began preparing for battle. The game was set, the trap was being laid, and the Italian Regia Marina sailed forward, completely blind to the catastrophe awaiting them off Cape Matapan. The caged tiger, Alexandria and the Mediterranean ablaze, March 25, 1941, 7:15 a.m. Admiral's Office, HMS Warspite, Alexandria Harbour, Egypt. Admiral Sir Andrew Brown. Cunningham stood at his cabin window, watching Alexandria Harbour come alive with the morning watch. At 58, ABC, as his men called him, cut an imposing figure. Compact, steel-eyed, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent 43 years at sea. His white uniform bore the 4 gold rings of a full admiral, but he wore them without pretension. Before him on the mahogany desk lay the Ultra Decrypt from Bletchley Park. He'd read it 6 times since its arrival the previous evening. Each reading hardened his resolve. "The bloody Italians are finally coming out to play," he muttered to his chief of staff, Commodore Edelston, who stood beside him. The Mediterranean in March 1941 was a cauldron of violence. British convoys struggled to supply Greece against the impending German invasion. Italian submarines prowled the sea lanes. Luftwaffe bombers from Sicily struck anything flying the white ensign. And the Italian battle fleet, powerful, modern and largely intact, remained the sword of Damocles hanging over every British operation. Cunningham had bloodied that fleet once before. On November 11, 1940, his carrier-borne swordfish biplanes had struck Taranto harbour in a night attack, crippling 3 Italian battleships at their moorings. The raid had been audacious, brilliant, and devastating, but it hadn't broken Italian naval power. Admiral Iachino still commanded formidable strength, battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, all faster than their British counterparts. Speed, that was the Italian advantage. Their newest battleship, Vittorio Veneto, could make 30 knots, fast enough to catch Cunningham's cruisers, fast enough to escape his battleships. In previous encounters, Italian commanders had used that speed to avoid decisive engagement, striking quickly before withdrawing beyond British reach. But now, thanks to Mavis Lever and Dilly Knox, Cunningham knew something the Italians didn't: their operational plans. He knew Iachino's departure time. He knew the Italian objective, intercepting British convoys south of Crete. He knew the Luftwaffe had promised air cover. Most crucially, he knew Iachino believed he'd achieve complete surprise. Cunningham turned from the window. "Signal Vice Admiral Pridham Whipple. His cruiser squadron is to proceed to position X south of Gavdapula Island by dawn, March 28th. He's to conduct a sweep as if covering convoy operations." Edelston nodded, making notes. "The Italians will spot him." "Exactly," Cunningham replied with a thin smile. "Pridham Whipple will be the bait. 4 light cruisers, Ajax, Orion, Perth, Gloucester, all with 6-inch guns, fast, visible, and apparently vulnerable." The plan crystallized in Cunningham's mind with surgical precision. Pridham Whipple's cruisers would appear as the escort for a non-existent convoy. Iachino, believing he'd caught the British by surprise, would commit his heavy units to the attack. And while the Italian admiral focused on Pridham Whipple's cruisers, Cunningham's battle squadron, 3 battleships, the carrier Formidable, and escorts, would close from the southeast like a closing fist. But secrecy was paramount. Ultra-intelligence was Britain's most closely guarded secret. If the Italians suspected their codes were compromised, they'd change their encryption systems and the intelligence window would slam shut. Every ultra-derived operation required careful camouflage, some plausible explanation for British foreknowledge. Cunningham had already planned his deception. That afternoon, he would go ashore conspicuously carrying a suitcase, as if planning to spend the night at the Alexandria Club. Italian intelligence agents, known to be operating in Alexandria, would report the British commander-in-chief was ashore, relaxed, unsuspecting. Meanwhile, reconnaissance aircraft would be ordered to discover the Italian fleet after it sailed, providing plausible cover for Cunningham's response. Outside the cabin window, HMS Warspite's crew moved with practiced efficiency. The 30,000-ton battleship had served since Jutland in 1916, but recent modernization made her formidable. 8 15-inch guns, heavy armor, and, crucially, radar. Her sisters, Valiant and Barham, lay moored nearby, equally ready. Cunningham glanced at the clock. 7:47 a.m. In 36 hours, his fleet would sail. In 60 hours, if his calculations proved correct, he would engage the Italian battle fleet under conditions of his choosing. For the first time in this war, the Mediterranean's balance of power might shift decisively. He turned back to Edelstein. Send for the ship captains, conference at 1400 hours, and inform Commander Power aboard Formidable. I want every serviceable aircraft ready for operations. Torpedo bombers, especially. The trap was being set. The Italian fleet, sailing blind into British waters, had no idea what awaited them. 72 hours of decryption. The race against time. March 25th, 1941. 11:20 p.m. Cottage number 3, Bletchley Park. Mavis Lever's eyes burned from 13 continuous hours of cryptanalysis. The worksheets before her had multiplied into chaotic piles. Intercepts from Italian naval stations across the Mediterranean, each one a potential fragment of Admiral Iachino's operational plan. Dilly Knox hadn't left the cottage since breakfast. He paced behind the rows of young women bent over their desks, his pipe creating a perpetual fog that hung beneath the cottage's low ceiling. Every 10 minutes, a motorcycle courier arrived from the intercept stations with fresh signals captured from Italian transmissions. Another from Supermarina Rome, called Margaret Rock from across the room, passing a fresh intercept sheet to Mavis. Encoded at 22:47 hours, high priority designation. Mavis took the sheet, her trained eyes immediately scanning for telltale patterns. Italian radio operators, working under pressure, made predictable mistakes. They reused key settings. They employed standard message formats. They inserted routine phrases, Duce e patria, per ordine di Supermarina, that provided cribs for breaking the daily cipher keys. The Enigma machine sitting at Knox's desk represented months of intelligence triumph. Unlike the German naval Enigma, with its complex 4-rotor configuration, the Italian Navy used a commercial 3-rotor variant. British cryptanalysts had acquired actual machines through various means: purchases from pre-war commercial suppliers, captures from vessels, cooperation with Polish intelligence. But having the machine was only the beginning. Each day, Italian operators selected new rotor positions, new ring settings, new plugboard configurations, millions of possible combinations. Breaking each day's traffic required identifying cribs, analyzing patterns, and methodically testing possibilities until the day's keys emerged. Mavis worked with systematic intensity. This intercept originated from Iachino's flagship Vittorio Veneto. The preamble indicated operational orders. The message length suggested detailed tactical instructions. She applied the rotor settings recovered from earlier traffic. Nothing. The letters remained gibberish. She tried variant ring positions. Still encrypted. Knox appeared at her shoulder. The plug board, he suggested quietly. Try reversing the C and K connections. Mavis adjusted her worksheet, recalculating with the modified plugboard setting. Letters began resolving into Italian words. Formazione da battaglia. Battleship Vittorio Veneto. Divisione incrociatori. Cruiser divisions Zara, Fiume, Pola. The order of battle was emerging. Iachino would sail with overwhelming force: 1 battleship, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 13 destroyers. Against this, Cunningham could field 3 battleships, but only if he knew where to position them. More, Knox urged, reading over her shoulder. Mavis continued decrypting. The tactical plan unfolded with clinical detail. Iachino would depart Taranto on the evening of March 26th. He would sail south through the Ionian Sea, then turn east toward Crete. German Luftwaffe units would provide air reconnaissance and fighter cover. The objective: intercept British convoy traffic between Alexandria and Greece. But one phrase made Knox stiffen. Intelligence indicates British battle fleet remains Alexandria harbour. They think we're still in port, Mavis said quietly. Knox nodded grimly. Which means Iachino will be aggressive. He believes he has surprise. He'll commit his heavy units close to shore. Another courier arrived, this time with an intercept from Luftwaffe units in Sicily. Knox took it personally, his eyes scanning the German text. His expression darkened. The Germans are promising reconnaissance coverage across the central Mediterranean, he translated. But they're pulling aircraft back for operations in Yugoslavia. The air cover Iachino expects may not materialize. The implications cascaded through both their minds. Iachino was sailing into battle expecting German air superiority that might never arrive. He was planning operations based on intelligence indicating British unpreparedness that was completely false. He was walking blind into a situation where every assumption could be wrong. By 2 a.m., Mavis had decrypted the complete operational order. By 3:30 a.m., it was encrypted into ultra-cipher and transmitted to the Admiralty. By 6 a.m., March 26, Admiral Cunningham in Alexandria knew not just that the Italians were coming, but exactly how, when, and where. The Italian Regia Marina was sailing into battle carrying detailed plans, and British intelligence was reading over their shoulder. Mavis finally left cottage number 3 at dawn, exhausted but exhilarated. She had no way of knowing that her work over those 72 hours would help orchestrate one of history's most one-sided naval victories. The Silent Departure. March 27th, evening at Alexandria. March 27th, 1941, 6:45 p.m., Alexandria Harbour, Egypt. Admiral Cunningham made a show of going ashore. He walked down HMS Warspite's gangway carrying a small suitcase, wearing civilian clothes, moving with the casual gait of a man anticipating a quiet evening at the Alexandria Sporting Club. Harbour workers watched him go. Dockside vendors noted his departure. And somewhere in Alexandria's shadows, Italian intelligence agents logged the observation. British Mediterranean Fleet Commander ashore for the evening. Exactly as Cunningham intended. By 7:30 p.m., he was back aboard Warspite through a discreet stern entrance. By 8:11 p.m., he stood on the bridge in full uniform, watching Alexandria's lights begin twinkling across the harbour. By 9:00 p.m., his entire battle fleet was preparing to slip moorings. Captain Douglas Fisher of HMS Warspite moved across the bridge with quiet efficiency. At 47, Fisher was a destroyer veteran from the Great War, known for steady nerves and aggressive tactics. His ship, the 30,600-ton battleship that had fought at Jutland, hummed with barely contained energy. "All stations report ready for sea, sir," Fisher reported. Cunningham nodded. "Very well. Signal the fleet. Proceed as ordered. Maintain wireless silence until further notice." The departure would be carefully orchestrated. First, Vice Admiral Pridham Whipple's light cruiser squadron would sail. They had the longest distance to cover, needing to reach their assigned position south of Crete by dawn on March 28th. Then Cunningham's battle squadron, Warspite, Valiant Barham, and the carrier Formidable screened by destroyers. At 9:12 p.m., HMS Ajax led Pridham Whipple's cruisers out of Alexandria Harbour. The light cruisers, Ajax, Orion, Perth, Gloucester, moved in single file through the swept channel, their grey hulls merging with the Mediterranean darkness. Behind them came 4 destroyers of the second flotilla. Aboard HMS Gloucester, Lieutenant Michael Goodenough watched the Egyptian coastline fade astern. At 24, Goodenough was one of the youngest gunnery officers in the Mediterranean fleet, but he'd already seen action at Calabria and Taranto. Tonight felt different. The entire fleet sailing together suggested something bigger than routine convoy escort. "Course?" the captain asked. 280, sir. Due west, then north toward Crete, came the navigator's response. Pridham Whipple's orders were precise. His squadron would sweep the waters south of Gavdapula Island at dawn, conducting a visible anti-submarine patrol as if screening convoy operations. If Italian reconnaissance spotted them, and Cunningham expected they would, The cruisers would appear as exactly what Iachino was hunting, a vulnerable British force far from supporting capital ships. At 10:30 p.m., Cunningham's battle squadron began departing. HMS Valiant led the way, her 30,000 tons moving with surprising grace through Alexandria's swept channel. Behind her came Barham, slightly older but recently modernized with improved anti-aircraft armament. Then Warspite herself, Cunningham's flagship, her 8 15-inch guns capable of hurling 1-ton shells 20 miles with devastating accuracy. Most crucial was HMS Formidable, the fleet carrier whose aircraft would provide reconnaissance, strike capability, and, potentially, the decisive blow. Commander Dennis Boyd stood on Formidable's bridge, mentally reviewing his air group, Fairey Fulmar fighters, Fairey Albacore torpedo bombers, and the aging but lethal Fairey Swordfish. 36 aircraft total, each one meticulously prepared for combat operations. The destroyer screen formed around the capital ships like protective wolves. HMS Jervis, Janus, Nubian, Mohawk, Stuart, Greyhound, Griffin, Havoc, destroyers of the 14th and 10th flotillas, their crews at action stations, their torpedo tubes loaded. By midnight, the entire British Mediterranean fleet was at sea, steaming north-northwest toward Crete. Behind them, Alexandria harbour lay nearly empty. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness beyond the horizon, Admiral Iachino's Italian battle fleet was also making passage, converging on the same killing ground. Cunningham stood on Warspite's bridge, the salt wind in his face. He'd fought in 3 wars across 4 decades. He'd commanded destroyers at Gallipoli, cruisers in the Atlantic, battleships in the Mediterranean. But this operation felt unique. For the first time in his career, he possessed near-complete intelligence about his opponent's plans. For the first time, the Royal Navy would fight a major engagement knowing exactly where the enemy would be, exactly when they'd arrive, exactly what they intended. "Weather forecast, sir," the staff meteorologist reported. "Clear skies expected through March 28th. Light winds, excellent visibility, new moon, darkness after 2100 hours. Perfect conditions for a night action." The British had trained extensively in night fighting, radar-directed gunnery, coordinated destroyer attacks, searchlight tactics. The Italians, by all intelligence reports, had not. At 1:15 a.m., March 28th, HMS Warspite crossed into the open Mediterranean. Ahead lay 280 miles of dark water, beyond that, Cape Matapan. And beyond that, an appointment with destiny that Admiral Iachino didn't yet know he'd made. The trap was moving into position. The prey was sailing forward. And in 36 hours, the Mediterranean would witness one of the most decisive naval ambushes of World War II. First blood, Gavdos, morning of March 28th, 1941. 6:35 a.m., HMS Orion, south of Gavdopoula Island, Greece. The sun rose over the Mediterranean like molten copper, painting the calm seas in shades of bronze and gold. Captain G.R.B. Back of HMS Orion stood on his bridge wing, binoculars raised, scanning the horizon with methodical precision. Behind him, 3 more light cruisers, Ajax, Perth, Gloucester, maintained formation at 14,000-yard intervals. 4 destroyers screened ahead. Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple's orders were clear. Conduct a visible sweep south of Crete, appear as if screening convoy operations, and draw Italian attention. The squadron had been at sea for 9 hours, maintaining radio silence, every man aware that somewhere beyond the horizon, superior Italian forces were hunting. At 7:39 a.m. the alarm sounded. "Bridge, lookout reports smoke bearing 340, distance approximately 15 miles, the voice crackled through the intercom. Pridham Whipple, aboard Orion, raised his glasses. Through the morning haze, dark smudges materialized on the northwestern horizon. Multiple contacts, heavy ships closing fast. "Sound action stations," he ordered calmly. Throughout the British cruiser squadron, klaxons wailed. Men ran to their battle positions. Gun turrets trained outboard. Magazine crews prepared ammunition. In Orion's plotting room, the gunnery team calculated ranges, bearings, and fire solutions. At 7:58 a.m., the Italian ships resolved into clarity. 3 heavy cruisers of the Trento class, Trento, Trieste, and Bolzano, each mounting 8 8-inch guns. Behind them came destroyers. The Italian admiral commanding this division, Luigi Sansonetti, had spotted Pridham Whipple's light cruisers and was closing for the kill. The range closed to 25,000 yards, then 23,000, then 21,000. At 8:12 a.m., orange flame blossomed from Trento's forward turrets. The 8-inch shells took 28 seconds to cover the distance. They arrived with the sound of freight trains tearing through the sky, crashing into the sea 200 yards short of HMS Gloucester, throwing up massive columns of white water that drenched the cruiser's forward deck. "Return fire," Pridham Whipple ordered. HMS Gloucester's 6 6-inch guns replied immediately. The lighter shells had less range than the Italian 8 inches, but Gloucester's gunnery officer was determined to make Sansonetti uncomfortable. Orange tracers arced across the Mediterranean morning. But the mathematics were brutal. The Italian heavy cruisers outranged, outgunned, and outweighed Pridham Whipple's light cruisers. Sansonetti was pushing 30 knots, and his 8-inch guns could tear a light cruiser apart at ranges where British 6-inch guns couldn't effectively reply. "Come to course 130, Pridham Whipple ordered. "Full speed." The British cruisers turned southeast, opening the range, drawing the Italians deeper into the trap. Behind them, Italian shells continued falling, each salvo walking closer as Italian rangefinders refined their calculations. At 8:27 a.m., a shell from Trieste struck HMS Gloucester's waterline. The 8-inch projectile punched through light armor plating and exploded in a supply compartment, killing 3 ratings instantly and starting a small fire. Damage control teams responded immediately, sealing bulkheads and fighting the flames. Aboard HMS Orion, Lieutenant Commander Manly Power watched the Italian cruisers through the fire control director. The enemy ships were magnificent, sleek, fast, heavily armed, their bows throwing impressive bow waves as they charged forward at maximum speed. Italian gunnery was effective, their salvos tightly grouped, their range-finding accurate. But Sansonetti had taken the bait. At 8:55 a.m., new smoke appeared on the northwestern horizon. Much heavier smoke, capital ship smoke. "Bridge. Lookout reports battleship bearing 315, the intercom reported. Vittorio Veneto had arrived. Admiral Angelo Iachino's flagship was a monster, 40,000 tons, 9 15-inch guns, capable of 30 knots. She could outrun anything she couldn't outfight, and outfight anything she couldn't outrun. Now she was charging southeast, closing to support Sansonetti's cruisers and annihilate Pridham Whipple's squadron. At 11,000 yards, Vittorio Veneto opened fire. The battleship's first salvo was terrifying in its precision. 3 15-inch shells, each weighing nearly a ton, bracketed HMS Ajax with fountains of water that rose 200 feet into the air. The concussive force of the near misses shook the light cruiser violently, cracking gauges and throwing men off their feet. Pridham Whipple's squadron was now in mortal danger. Behind them, Italian heavy cruisers. Ahead, more Italian forces reported by reconnaissance. And converging from the northwest, the most powerful battleship in the Mediterranean. But 140 miles to the southeast, Admiral Cunningham's battle squadron was steaming north at maximum speed. And aboard HMS Formidable, aircraft engines were roaring to life. The dance had begun, first blood had been drawn, and the morning's action was only the prelude to the slaughter that would come after darkness fell. Wings of Fire, the Albacore's attack, March 28, 1941, 11:27 a.m., HMS Formidable, Central Mediterranean. Lieutenant Commander Gerald Saunt climbed into the cockpit of his Fairey Albacore torpedo bomber, his hands moving through the pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. The Albacore, Newer than the legendary Swordfish, but sharing its biplane configuration, sat on Formidable's flight deck, its 130 horsepower engine ticking and cooling in the Mediterranean sun. Behind Sant, his observer and air gunner settled into their positions. Beneath the fuselage hung an 18-inch Mark 15 torpedo, 1,600 pounds of explosive power that could break a battleship's spine if placed correctly. Commander Dennis Boyd, Formidable's air group commander, stood on the carrier's island, watching 6 albacores prepare for launch. The attack had been meticulously planned, a coordinated strike against Vittorio Veneto, timed to catch the Italian battleship while she pursued Pridham Whipple's cruisers. "All aircraft report ready for launch," the flight deck officer reported. "Launch strike," Boyd ordered. At 11:36 a.m., Sant's albacore roared down Formidable's flight deck and into the air. 5 more torpedo bombers followed in rapid succession, their fixed landing gear hanging beneath biplane wings that seemed impossibly fragile for the violence they were about to deliver. The strike climbed to 8,000 feet, formed up, and turned northwest. Sant checked his instruments. Fuel, oil pressure, torpedo arming switch. Below, the Mediterranean stretched in all directions, impossibly blue under the midday sun. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, the most powerful battleship in the Italian Navy was charging southeast, completely unaware of the death approaching from above. At 12:07 p.m., Sant spotted his target. Vittorio Veneto was magnificent even from 5 miles away. Her 3 triple turrets, her raked funnel, her powerful lines. She was the embodiment of Italian naval design philosophy, speed, firepower, and striking appearance. She was making perhaps 28 knots, her bow wave brilliant white against the dark blue sea. Around her, destroyers maintained anti-aircraft formation. Sant keyed his radio. "All aircraft, this is leader. Target confirmed, bearing 310, range 4 miles. Execute attack plan Alpha." The albacores spread into attacking formation. 3 would approach from the starboard bow, forcing Vittorio Veneto to turn. 3 more would attack from the port quarter, catching her as she maneuvered. Classic torpedo bomber tactics, hammer and anvil. At 12:19 p.m., Sant pushed his stick forward and began his attack dive. The albacore accelerated rapidly, dropping from 8,000 feet toward the wavetops. Wind howled through the struts and rigging. The altimeter unwound like a broken clock. At 2,200 feet, Sant leveled off, now approaching Vittorio Veneto at 160 knots just above the Mediterranean surface. The Italian battleship's anti-aircraft batteries erupted. Tracer fire, red, orange, white, streamed across the sky in deadly geometric patterns. Flak bursts blossomed in black puffs around the approaching aircraft. A 90mm shell exploded 50 yards to Sant's left, the concussion hammering the albacore sideways. In the rear cockpit, the air gunner fired back, his Lewis gun chattering defiance at the massive warship. Range, 2,000 yards. Vittorio Veneto was turning hard to port, her entire starboard side visible, her wake carving a massive arc through the sea. Range, 1,500 yards. Anti-aircraft fire intensified. Sant could see individual gunners on the battleship's superstructure. Range, 1,000 yards. The torpedo targeting angle was good, perhaps 70 degrees on the battleship's beam. Range, 800 yards. Sant pressed the release button. The torpedo dropped cleanly, hitting the water with a massive splash, its motor igniting instantly. The 18-inch weapon disappeared beneath the surface, running at 40 knots toward Vittorio Veneto's hull. Sant pulled up hard, banking left to clear the battleship's anti-aircraft field of fire. Behind him, 5 more albacores were pressing their attacks, each releasing their torpedoes at point-blank range. Aboard Vittorio Veneto, Admiral Iachino watched the torpedo tracks converging on his flagship. The battleship's helmsman threw the wheel hard over, reversing his turn, trying desperately to comb the torpedo wakes. At 12:21 p.m., 1 torpedo struck home. The explosion occurred on Vittorio Veneto's port quarter, just above the outboard propeller shaft. The 1,600-pound warhead detonated against the battleship's hull, plating with catastrophic force, blowing a hole 20 feet across through armor and inner bulkheads. Seawater flooded into machinery spaces. The port outer propeller shaft twisted, seized, and stopped. On Vittorio Veneto's bridge, the shock threw men off their feet. Damage reports flooded in. Progressive flooding in compartments 185 through 192. Port shaft disabled, steering temporarily lost, speed reduced to 19 knots. Iachino's face went pale. 19 knots, less than two-thirds of his flagship's maximum speed. And somewhere to the southeast, British battleships were closing. For the first time since departing Taranto, Admiral Iachino understood that he might not be hunting British cruisers. He might be the prey in someone else's trap. At 12:29 p.m., he gave the order that sealed the fate of his heavy cruiser squadron. All units, discontinue pursuit. Form on flagship. Course 315. Return to base. The Italian fleet turned for home, but daylight was fading, and Admiral Cunningham was closing fast. Daniel Stead's sacrifice, March 28, 1941. 3:17 p.m. HMS Formidable, 90 miles southeast of Cape Matapan. Lieutenant Commander John Daniel Stead sat in the ready room, studying the reconnaissance photographs with intense concentration. At 31, Daniel Stead commanded 826 Naval Air Squadron, Formidable's Albacore torpedo bomber unit. The morning strike had damaged Vittorio Veneto, but intelligence reports indicated the Italian battleship had partially recovered, now making perhaps 16 knots northwest toward home. Commander Boyd entered the ready room. Second strike launches at 15:30 hours. 6 albacores, 3 swordfish from Maleme as supporting element. Your squadron will lead. Daniel Stead nodded. The mission was straightforward but lethal. Catch Vittorio Veneto before darkness. Slow her further. Allow Cunningham's battleships to close for the kill. But the Italian fleet would be alert now, their anti-aircraft crews at maximum readiness, their destroyer screen reinforced. At 3:30 p.m., Daniel Stead's Albacore launched from Formidable's deck. 5 more aircraft followed, forming up in the Mediterranean afternoon. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the calm sea. Within 4 hours, darkness would fall. Within 4 hours, this battle would transition from daylight action to night combat, and the British held every advantage in darkness. The strike flew northwest, climbing to 6,000 feet. Daniel Stead's observer scanned the horizon with binoculars, watching for the Italian fleet. At 4:47 p.m., he spotted them, Vittorio Veneto, surrounded by destroyers, cruisers flanking, all steering northwest in tight formation. Italian air cover was notably absent. The Luftwaffe units promised to Iachino had failed to materialize. Pulled back to support operations in Yugoslavia, exactly as Bletchley Park's intelligence had suggested. Iachino was sailing without the air protection he'd been promised. But Vittorio Veneto's anti-aircraft armament was formidable. 12 90mm guns, 20 37mm guns, dozens of 20mm cannon, all radar-directed, all experienced from the morning's action. Daniel Stead keyed his radio. All aircraft, target is the battleship. Coordinate attack from multiple bearings. Good luck. The albacores separated, approaching Vittorio Veneto from 3 directions simultaneously. Daniel Stead's flight would attack from the port bow, forcing the battleship to turn. 2 more aircraft would strike from starboard. The remaining aircraft would follow up, exploiting whatever maneuvering the battleship committed to. At 4:53 p.m., Daniel Stead began his attack dive. The anti-aircraft fire started immediately, heavier than the morning's action, more coordinated, more accurate. Italian gunners had learned from the first strike. Flak bursts now appeared in dense clusters, creating killing zones through which the British aircraft had to fly. Daniel Stead pressed through the fire, descending to 50 feet above the wave tops. His albacore shuddered as shrapnel punched through fabric and metal. The windscreen cracked. His observer called out damage reports, his voice tight with controlled fear. Range, 1,200 yards. Vittorio Veneto filled Danielle Stead's vision, massive, turning, her entire port side ablaze with anti-aircraft fire. Range, 900 yards. A 37mm shell exploded directly ahead, the blast tearing fabric from the Albacore's upper wing. Range, 700 yards. Too close. Danielle Stead should have released his torpedo. He continued flying directly toward the battleship. Range, 400 yards. From this range, he couldn't miss. At this range, even Vittorio Veneto's evasive maneuvering couldn't avoid a well-aimed torpedo. At this range, Lieutenant Commander John Danielle Stead could guarantee a hit. At 200 yards, he released. The torpedo dropped perfectly, striking the water directly ahead of Vittorio Veneto's bow. The 18-inch weapon ran true, its track aimed at the battleship's vitals. But Danielle Stead's Albacore, torn by anti-aircraft fire, its engines streaming coolant, couldn't climb away. The biplane staggered, banked weakly left, and crashed into the Mediterranean in a massive spray of white water. No parachutes emerged. No survivors appeared in the wreckage. At 4:55 p.m., Danielle Stead's torpedo struck Vittorio Veneto's port side amidships. The explosion, much closer to the battleship's engineering spaces than the morning's hit, caused catastrophic flooding. Vittorio Veneto's speed dropped to 12 knots, then 8, then barely 5 as her engineering crews fought to contain the damage. Admiral Iachino, standing on his damaged flagship's bridge, now faced a nightmare scenario. His battleship was crippled 180 miles from home. British battleships were closing, and darkness, which would hide his retreat, would also conceal British approach. At 5:12 p.m., he made his fatal decision. He ordered his heavy cruiser squadron, Zara, Fiume, Polar, and destroyers, to turn back and screen Vittorio Veneto's withdrawal. The Italian cruisers, sailing without radar into gathering darkness, were now positioned exactly where Admiral Cunningham wanted them. Lieutenant Commander John Danielle Stead's sacrifice had set the stage for massacre. Hunt in Darkness, The Night Pursuit, March 28, 1941. 7:43 p.m. HMS Warspite, 45 miles south of Cape Matapan. Darkness fell across the Mediterranean like a closing curtain. Admiral Cunningham stood on Warspite's bridge, watching the last light fade from the western horizon. Behind him, Valiant and Barham maintained close formation, 3 battleships in line ahead, surrounded by destroyers. Ahead, somewhere in the gathering night, the crippled Italian fleet was retreating northwest. The hunt was entering its most dangerous phase. Cunningham had trained his fleet extensively in night combat, something the Italians, by all intelligence reports, had neglected. British ships carried radar for surface search and fire control. British gun crews had practiced night gunnery using starshell illumination and searchlight tactics. British destroyer captains were masters of night torpedo attacks, but night combat remained chaotic, unpredictable, and lethal to both sides. Friend or foe identification became nearly impossible. Coordinated maneuvers turned difficult. A single error could send ships colliding or firing on their own forces. At 8:03 p.m., Warspite's radar detected contacts bearing 315 degrees, range 22,000 yards. Multiple surface contacts, the radar operator reported, his voice crackling through the intercom. Estimate 4 to 6 large vessels, course approximately 310, speed 8 knots. Cunningham leaned over the radar repeater display. The green phosphorescent blips showed a formation consistent with Iachino's battle group: damaged battleship, cruiser escort, destroyers. They were moving slowly northwest. Vittorio Veneto, clearly still crippled from the torpedo hits. "Come to course 315, Cunningham ordered. "Increase speed to 20 knots, close to gun range." The 3 British battleships turned in unison, their massive hulls cutting through calm seas, their wakes phosphorescent in the darkness. Around them, destroyers maintained station, their commanders hungry for torpedo firing opportunities. But at 8:27 p.m., something unexpected appeared on Warspite's radar. "New contacts bearing 320, range 14,000 yards, the radar operator called. "Three large vessels, stationary or slow-moving. They're not with the main group." In Warspite's plotting room, the tactical situation crystallized. The contacts weren't Iachino's battle group. Those ships were farther northwest, still withdrawing. These were different vessels, positioned between Cunningham's battle squadron and the retreating Italians. Italian heavy cruisers. The screen Iachino had ordered back to protect Vittorio Veneto's withdrawal, and they were sailing without radar, without night-fighting training, without any awareness that three British battleships were approaching from their stern. Cunningham felt the tactical opportunity like a physical sensation. Those Italian cruisers, probably Zara, Fiume, and Pola based on intelligence reports, were positioned perfectly for ambush. They were between Cunningham's battleships and their objective. They were moving slowly, probably conducting anti-submarine searches. They had no idea they were about to sail into the gun range of the Mediterranean fleet's heaviest units. "All ships, maintain complete light discipline," Cunningham ordered. "No navigation lights, no gunfire without my order. Close silently to 4,000 yards. HMS Warspite crept forward through the darkness. Behind her, Valiant and Barham followed, three massive predators stalking prey that couldn't see them coming. The battleship's gun crews stood at their stations, 15-inch shells loaded, breeches closed, waiting. At 9:17 p.m., lookouts aboard Warspite spotted the Italian cruisers visually. They were almost invisible against the night sky, dark shapes moving slowly across darker water, but trained eyes could see them. Three heavy cruisers in line ahead, destroyers nearby, all steaming northwest at perhaps 12 knots. Range, 6,000 yards. The Italian ships showed no awareness of British proximity. Their lookouts scanned the horizon, but they were looking forward, searching for British forces ahead, never imagining that Cunningham's battle squadron was approaching from astern. Range, 5,000 yards. In Warspite's director control tower, the gunnery team tracked their targets with radar precision. The fire control computer calculated range, bearing, target speed, shell ballistics, wind, temperature, transforming these variables into firing solutions for 8 15-inch guns. Range, 4,000 yards. At this distance, the British battleship's 15-inch guns couldn't miss. At this distance, armor-piercing shells weighing nearly a ton each would punch through Italian cruiser armor like paper. At this distance, the engagement would be less a battle than an execution. Cunningham checked his watch. 10:19 p.m. He'd been tracking these Italian cruisers for over an hour, closing silently through darkness, positioning his battleships for the perfect firing solution. The Italian Regia Marina had sailed blind into this battle, guided by false intelligence and broken codes. Now they would pay the price for that blindness. "All ships," Cunningham ordered quietly, "stand by, illuminate and engage on my command." The massacre was seconds away. Massacre at 22:20. The perfect ambush, March 28, 1941. 10:20 p.m. HMS Warspite, 3,800 yards, astern of Italian cruiser squadron. "Illuminate," Admiral Cunningham ordered. Warspite's 44-inch searchlight stabbed through the darkness like a physical blow. The massive beam, powerful enough to blind men at a mile, caught the aftermost Italian cruiser perfectly, transforming night into harsh artificial daylight. The cruiser was Fiume, 11,500 tons, 8 8-inch guns. Her crew had been at action stations for 14 hours, exhausted, straining eyes into darkness, searching for threats ahead. They never looked astern. In that single frozen instant, Fiume's crew saw 3 British battleships at point-blank range, their 15-inch guns trained directly at them. "Shoot," Cunningham said quietly. HMS Warspite fired at 10:20 p.m. 8 15-inch guns discharged simultaneously with a concussive roar that made the entire 30,000-ton battleship shudder. 8 armor-piercing shells, each weighing 1,138 pounds, crossed 3,800 yards of darkness in 4.7 seconds. 5 shells struck Fiume. The first hit penetrated Fiume's after turret, detonating the magazine beneath. The explosion tore the entire stern section apart, hurling metal fragments hundreds of feet into the air. The second shell punched through the cruiser's thin deck armor and exploded in the engineering spaces, killing every man in the boiler rooms instantly. The third and fourth shells struck amidships, devastating crew quarters and starting massive fires. The fifth shell penetrated the forward magazine, but by then Fiume was already dying. The entire engagement, from illumination to Fiume's destruction, lasted 90 seconds. Behind Warspite, HMS Valiant and Barham opened fire. Their combined 16 15-inch guns engaged the second Italian cruiser, Zara, flagship of the heavy cruiser division. Aboard Zara, Vice Admiral Carlo Cattaneo stood frozen on the bridge, illuminated by British searchlights, watching his squadron die. He had no time to give orders, no time to maneuver, no time even to comprehend what was happening. Valiant's first salvo struck Zara's bridge directly. The 15-inch shells obliterated the entire superstructure, killing Cattaneo and every officer on the bridge instantly. Barham's salvo hit seconds later, penetrating Zara's machinery spaces and stopping her engines. Follow-up salvos from all 3 British battleships continued hammering the crippled crew. Follow-up salvos from all 3 British battleships continued hammering the crippled cruiser, transforming Zara into a floating inferno. Within 3 minutes, she was dead in the water, listing heavily to port, fires consuming her from stem to stern. The third Italian cruiser, Pola, had been crippled hours earlier by torpedo damage and lay stopped in the water. British destroyers were already closing on her position. The Italian destroyers Vittorio Alfieri and Giosuè Carducci attempted to fight back. Their commanders, seeing their cruiser squadron annihilated, charged toward the British battleships with suicidal courage. At 10,000 yards, they launched torpedoes, spread patterns that had minimal chance of hitting in the darkness and chaos. British destroyers intercepted them. HMS Jervis, Stuart and Havoc closed at high speed, their 4 7-inch guns blazing. The engagement was brief and brutal. Alfieri took multiple hits, her thin hull plating no match for destroyer gunfire at close range. She exploded at 10:47 p.m., her forward magazine detonating with catastrophic force. Carducci lasted slightly longer, fighting desperately until overwhelmed by concentrated fire from 3 British destroyers. She sank at 11:15 p.m. By 11:30 p.m., the massacre was complete. Fiume had sunk 20 minutes after being hit. Zara burned for another hour before capsizing and disappearing beneath the Mediterranean. Pola lay, stopped and helpless, her crew abandoning ship as British destroyers approached. Admiral Cunningham stood on Warspite's bridge, watching the fires burn across the dark water. The engagement had lasted barely over an hour. His battleships had fired fewer than 100 main battery shells. British casualties, none from the surface action. Italian casualties, 3 heavy cruisers destroyed, 2 destroyers sunk, over 2,000 men dead or dying in the water. At 2:30 a.m., March 29th, HMS Jervis approached the crippled Pola. The Italian cruiser's crew had abandoned their posts, many already in the water. British sailors boarded the listing vessel, searching for survivors and intelligence documents. They found chaos, bodies, flooding compartments, fires still burning below decks. Commander St. John Tyrwhitt of HMS Jervis ordered the Italian crew taken off. Over 200 men were pulled from the water and from Pola's decks. At 4:03 a.m., with dawn approaching and Luftwaffe air attacks expected, Jervis fired torpedoes into Pola's hull. The Italian cruiser sank within minutes. Cunningham's fleet turned southeast, withdrawing at high speed before German aircraft could arrive. Behind them, the Mediterranean was filled with hundreds of Italian survivors clinging to wreckage, life rafts, debris. British ships had rescued 905 men, but hundreds more remained in the water. Cunningham transmitted their coordinates to Italian rescue vessels before departing. The Battle of Cape Matapan was over. The most decisive British naval victory since Trafalgar had been won not through superior numbers or firepower, but through intelligence, deception, and tactical brilliance. Ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park had revealed Italian plans. Cunningham's deception had masked British preparations. And night-fighting tactics, radar-guided gunnery, searchlight illumination, coordinated destroyer attacks had transformed tactical advantage into complete annihilation. The Italian Regia Marina had sailed blind into the trap, and they had paid the ultimate price for that blindness. Dawn among wreckage, the price of blindness, March 29th, 1941. 6:47 a.m. Mediterranean Sea, 22 miles southeast of Cape Matapan. Dawn broke across the Mediterranean in shades of rose and gold. The calm seas that had witnessed the previous night's slaughter now reflected the morning sun with serene indifference. But the water wasn't empty. Seaman Giuseppe Romano clung to a piece of wreckage from the cruiser Zara. He'd been in the water for 7 hours. His hands were numb, his legs had stopped responding an hour ago. Around him, dozens of other survivors floated in clusters, calling out to each other, their voices hoarse from swallowing seawater and screaming during the night. Romano had been in Zara's forward magazine when the British battleships opened fire. He remembered the searchlights, impossibly bright, turning night into day. He remembered the first salvo hitting somewhere aft, the entire ship shuddering, as if struck by an earthquake. He remembered his commander ordering the magazine crews to evacuate seconds before another shell penetrated the deck above them. He'd made it topside to find his ship dying. Fires everywhere. The superstructure collapsed. Men jumping into the water. And in the darkness, the shapes of British battleships firing again and again, their guns creating orange flashes that silhouetted Zara's death throes. At 7:15 a.m., Italian hospital ship Gradisca arrived at the coordinates transmitted by Admiral Cunningham. Her crew worked frantically, pulling survivors from the water. Romano was hauled aboard at 8:23 a.m., hypothermic and barely conscious. He would be one of the lucky ones. Of the approximately 2,400 Italian sailors from the cruisers Zara, Fiume and Pola, and the destroyers Alfieri and Carducci, only 1,015 would be rescued. The rest died in the water, from drowning, hypothermia, wounds or shark attacks in the hours before rescue arrived. It was the Italian Navy's worst single-day loss of the entire war. Aboard HMS Warspite, 180 miles to the southeast, Admiral Cunningham composed his after-action report. The battle had exceeded his most optimistic projections. 5 Italian warships sunk, over 2,300 enemy casualties, British losses, 1 Albacore torpedo bomber and its 3-man crew. Lieutenant Commander Daliel Stead's sacrifice had been the only British fatalities of the entire engagement. But Cunningham understood the broader implications. The Italian battle fleet, once a serious threat to British Mediterranean operations, would never again seek decisive engagement. Vittorio Veneto had limped back to Taranto, damaged but afloat. Her survival ensured the Italian fleet remained a fleet in being, tying down British resources. But Italian naval doctrine had been shattered at Matapan. Never again would Italian admirals willingly engage British capital ships. The psychological impact was devastating. Italian naval commanders now operated under the shadow of Matapan. The knowledge that British intelligence could read their plans, that British night-fighting capability was superior, that sailing without adequate air cover invited annihilation. More importantly, the battle demonstrated ultra-intelligence's decisive value. Mavis Lever's cryptanalysis had provided Cunningham with complete knowledge of Italian plans. That intelligence advantage, carefully concealed through deception and plausible deniability, had transformed a potentially even engagement into a one-sided massacre. At Bletchley Park, News of the victory arrived via encrypted signals on March 29th. Dilly Knox, reading the battle reports in cottage number 3, allowed himself a rare smile. His work, and Mavis Lever's breakthrough on the Italian naval enigma, had directly enabled one of the Royal Navy's greatest victories. Mavis herself was already working on the next batch of intercepts. The war continued, the Enigma machines continued transmitting, and the invisible battle of code-breaking, fought in Victorian cottages with pencil and paper, continued to shape the visible battles fought with guns and steel. In Rome, Mussolini received news of the disaster with cold fury. His navy, the pride of fascist Italy, had been humiliated. 3 modern cruisers sunk, over 2,000 sailors lost. The Regia Marina's reputation shattered. He demanded explanations, investigations, scapegoats. But the real explanation was simple and devastating. The Italian fleet had sailed blind into battle against an enemy who could see everything. They had operated on false intelligence, broken codes, and overconfidence. They had underestimated British night-fighting capability. They had sailed without adequate air cover into waters dominated by enemy carriers. The Battle of Cape Matapan demonstrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Information dominance could be more decisive than numerical superiority. The Italian fleet had been defeated not primarily by British battleships, but by British codebreakers working 800 miles away in an English country house. As the Mediterranean sun climbed higher on March 29th, 1941, the wreckage from 5 Italian warships drifted slowly on the current. Bodies floated among the debris. Oil slicks spread across miles of water. The calm sea, so beautiful in the morning light, had become a graveyard. The Italian Regia Marina had sailed blind into battle. Ultra-intelligence had guided the British fleet to Cape Matapan like a perfect ambush. And the price of that blindness had been written in blood across the Mediterranean's dark waters. The balance of naval power in the Mediterranean had shifted decisively, and it would never shift back.